Um, Dave, thanks again for joining us. Can you share a little bit about the podcasts that you host and a little bit about your background and how you got started in podcasting?
Yeah, sure. So there are currently 3 podcasts that I host. The longest running one I've been doing for 15 years, that's called Geek Gab, and that's a Q&A show for Apple users. When we started it, the Mac was really the only product Apple had, so that's why we named it that. But now, of course, they have the iPhone and iPad and all that other stuff. So there's that one, and then about 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago now, we started 2 more shows. The Small Business Show, which caters to small business owners, and then Gig Gab, which is for working musicians. And the way I got started in podcasting was for 21, almost 22 years, have been publishing a website called the Mac Observer at macobserver.com. And 15 years ago, podcasting was sort of starting to become, a thing. And I thought, yeah, we need to have a podcast here. So we started what became Mac Geek Gab. The first week, I don't think we had come up with the name yet. I think we just called it TMO to go, the Mac Observer to go, as an audio show. And then, it sort of grew from there. The idea was that I was going to start it and pass it off. I clearly failed at that. But the first week, the topic was whatever Apple's new operating system at the time was. My co-host and I, who's the same co-host, John F. Braun, he and I talked through how we migrated to it or something. I can't remember what the second week was. And then the third week, I had no idea what we wanted our topics to be. So I said, let's pretend that we got questions in the mailbag, even though we haven't gotten any. We'll phoning them up. It'll be fine. And we'll answer some questions and actually use that as sort of the way we share some tips we want to share. That did it. The mailbag has been full ever since. And that's 15 years later. So, yeah.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I also, when I first started at the job I'm at now, we started a podcast too. And on my first week, I was like, oh man, if I have to keep doing this like week after week, I don't know how long I could, keep doing these podcasts. And it's been 2 years now, over 100 episodes. And
Yep.
yeah, it kind of does start to feel a lot more natural. And I actually look forward towards it each week. So it's funny how that works out.
It is, yeah. And we have started other podcasts at the Mac Observer. I don't host them, but there's 3 others that we do. And my problem was, when we started Mac Geek Gab, I think we launched 3 or 4 weeks before Apple's podcast directory in iTunes came out. And we knew it was coming because in March of that year, we launched in June. In March of that year, Steve Jobs had taken the stage wherever he was and said that they were coming out with this podcast directory. And it was clear it was a pet project of his. And so as soon as we started the show, I started asking all my friends at Apple, like, I want to make sure we're in your directory the day that it launches, And this was, of course, back when Steve was running Apple and everybody was afraid to say anything. And I finally got frustrated after talking to like 4 different people. They're like, well, it's not me and I can't really tell you. And I was like, man, what a stupid way to run a company. Everybody's afraid to actually help the company do a thing that the company should want to do. Like, you've got these shows, you should want to be in there. So out of frustration, I wrote an email to Steve Jobs. And 20 minutes later, my phone rang with Keith, who was the manager of the podcast directory. And he said, hey, we've got your email. Of course, you're in the directory. We're going to make sure to feature you in week 1. And that's when our listeners grew from like 1,000 to 20,000 in 1 week when the directory came out. And that's why I couldn't stop doing the show. But that was okay. It's not a bad problem.
So with the different shows, how did you determine the format of each podcast, whether you have a new guest every week or whether you keep the same hosts, and how often do you publish them? So how did you kind of figure out the formula for that?
Yeah. So, with Mac Geek Gab, like I said, we stumbled onto the formula that works for that show, and we've been very fortunate. But I always knew that having a consistent release schedule was going to be one of the most important things we could do, because if we were fortunate enough to get someone that liked the show, that wanted to listen every week, let's say they listen on Wednesday mornings when they do their Wednesday morning workout. Well, if we don't publish an episode, they're still going to do their Wednesday morning workout. And if they really like us, they might forgive us if we skip 1 week. But if we skip 2 weeks, they've found something else. So I knew that release schedule was important. Because of that, I built a workflow so that we could release episodes 15 minutes or less after finishing recording. And that meant, doing a lot of work and up front to come up with topics and things like that, and prepping to make sure that we could just essentially record live to tape. With Geek Gab and Small Business Show, we often have guests, but not always. And my co-host and I, Shannon Jean, and it was Shannon's idea to do the show. He and I often are able to, in fact, not often, always, are able to come up with some topic. And the same is true for Geek Gab. When we don't have a guest, and Geek Gab sort of have guests far less frequently than Small Business Show. So we just keep a shared document going. It could be a shared note in Apple Notes or a shared Google Doc or whatever. And when an idea comes, we make sure to capture it in that document so that we've got something to then expand upon. Because as I've learned, it seems like the most obvious thing at the time. You're like, oh, I'll never forget this. And then you definitely forget it. So being able to kind of have that list of things that we can go back to. Now, sometimes we'll sit down to record and we'll have had a topic, but something will have come up for one of us. And it'll be like, oh, this is like, definitely, we got to go through this, or a listener will have written in about something. But otherwise, we've got kind of a deep roster of things that we can expand on at any given point in time. So that's how we do it, is making sure to just always have kind of a list, a running list of potential topics. And so
Right.
That's how we do it. Yep.
I think you answered the next question I was going to ask, with how you come up with topics for the shows and what that process looks like. Are there any other methodologies that you use to help come up with topics?
Asking our listeners for what they want us to talk about is great. And really, truly making sure that we acknowledge that in the flow of the show. When people are listening and they hear that other people's comments or questions or tips or whatever it is are actually being given attention, that encourages people to write in their own stuff. And it's really hard to get people to write in consistently, but if you can do it, obviously that can be great too. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to some of or what are the most effective ways that you've connected with your listeners and gotten their input. And this is something that I struggle with myself with my own podcast, is at the end of each episode, we do try and incorporate a message like, you can leave comments here at this website or leave a review here, but we haven't gotten as much, interaction back and forth with our listeners as we would want or expect. So what are some ways that you kind of facilitate that?
Yeah, I wish I had a magic formula, because like I said, for Mac Geek Gab, we get, 100 emails a week into that show, if more. And the other two shows, like a week can go with no email whatsoever. And yeah, the listeners, it's a bigger audience for Mac Geek Gab than it is for the others, but it still doesn't track. Like the percentage wise, it doesn't work. And I mean, truly providing value for people, and we're doing tech support on that show. So that's really, if you can provide value and answer a question that's valuable for the listeners, I think that's one way to do it. You can run contests and that sort of thing to sort of spur things along. Make sure you're telling people how to reach you in a variety of different ways. And you don't necessarily need to do each way in each episode, because that can, if you've got 5 different ways to reach you, that can, it can become a whole segment in and of itself. And maybe that's your shtick. Maybe there is a segment about that, right? But making sure, because not everybody thinks, oh, I'll send emails. Some people think, oh, I follow these folks on Twitter. I want to be able to send them messages there. I use Twitter a lot. And if you say, hey, follow us, Matt Geek Gab on Twitter or something, okay, then you'll get messages from them that way, or Facebook, or wherever. Find where your listeners are, and then go be there, and be present there. So if you do get comments, via YouTube, if you're publishing there, or whatever, Facebook or whatever, make sure you go read them, reply to them, engage, because if someone reaches out and nothing happens, they're not going to reach out again. So
Yeah, that's a great tip and something that we'll definitely have to try implementing. Um,
it's hard.
yeah.
It's hard.
um, in terms of how long it takes for you to produce an average episode, from the planning to the recording to the editing and publishing, how long do you think that you spend on an average one?
Yeah. For Matt Geek Gab, it's probably about 5 hours of prep time, maybe 6. And then recording the episode usually takes another, it's an hour and a half episode, but we get together first, we sort of talk things through. And then I do have, 15, now maybe 30 minutes of post-production time, because we're doing video and stuff now. So I've sort of broken my own rules, but not really. So it's probably a 9 or 10 hour investment for that show every week. And that, that includes, well, that includes some of the technical research that we have to do to answer people's questions, but not all of it. I mean, then there's sort of the other stuff that I do because I'm just a geek and I like to stay up to date on different tech stuff. And being, having that stuff kind of swimming in my head helps me when it comes time to answer these questions. So it's probably 10 plus hours realistically, but I can count 10 hours on my hand every week that we're doing for that show. The other shows, maybe 2 or 3 hours for those, depending on what the topic is and how we do it. So yeah.
Yeah, it definitely depends. I do like how it seems as though all the podcasts you're involved with, you actually have a lot of interest and, passion in those topics too, I think is really important in running a podcast.
It's super important. Yeah. I've always said you have to make a podcast that you would want to listen to, right? And because you'll actually do a good job with that. If you're doing a show that's just like somebody gave you a form and you're like, okay, I got to do a show about this. You might, I mean, we're all professionals and we all wind up doing things that aren't our favorite things to do, and that's fine. But with podcasting, I think that there's a greater degree of transparency there between host and listener. And if you're doing something that you're not passionate about, your listeners are going to know, and you're just not going to attract listeners. So we've always said we want to make shows that we would want to listen to. And that seems to work out really well because then we're passionate about it. And that makes it easier to take the extra step to really get it right, to do it right. So yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Was there a point where you kind of realized that, okay, these podcasts are something that I really want to stick it out with? So a lot of times we'll tell publishers or just anyone in general, the best way to find out if something will work is to just give it a try. But at that same time, there's always a part of that where you have to determine, when it's time to call it quits or when it's time to pivot to a new idea. So what was that kind of moment for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed doing the shows, but like I said, my plan with initially was to just start it, get the machine rolling, and then hand it to somebody else. And then I realized, no, I like this. I want to keep doing it. I like having this touch point. I Before and even after we had started Mac Observer, I always had my own consulting business where I would go to people's houses, kind of like pre-Geek Squad thing, where I'd go to people's houses and fix their computers. And it was good money, but I really liked that moment where you solved somebody's problem and you were like the superhero, like you like they were so happy that they, had found you and you were able to do that work. And we get a lot of that with the shows. And so it was like, oh, wait a minute, I can keep actually stretching this muscle and keep doing this kind of tech support without having to carve time out of my day to leave the office and do it. And at the time I didn't really have the time to go out and do that consulting. So it was that all kind of came together and I was like, yeah, I want to keep doing this. And that, you know, I mean, we were already invested. We were already, you know, perfecting our craft and honing our craft, but it, you know, that at that moment it made it easier. One thing I will add is, you know, I said that release schedule, consistent release schedule is super important. Another thing that, you know, your listeners will forgive you occasionally, but you can't get away with often is bad audio quality. You've got to focus on having good audio quality. 15 years ago, I mean, it was doable. It's way easier now to really get good audio quality, but you want to make sure you're using a microphone that's not just picking up a lot of room noise. You know, I always say, you don't want the sound of my noisy room being broadcast into your noisy room, right? So I try to give people a nice, clean, clear show, levels balanced between the hosts so people aren't having to twist the volume knob. Like, that audio quality thing makes a huge difference. So if you're doing a podcast, go out, listen to it in your car. That's a great place to tell if you've got balance issues, because if you do, the road noise will bury one of the speakers and you're constantly cranking up the volume. If you're doing that, then you got to fix it because your listeners are doing it too. So
Yeah, definitely. I know this wasn't part of the questions, but could you dive a little deeper into the tools that you use for editing and noise reduction and things like that?
sure. Yeah. So I'm a Mac guy, as you might have guessed from what I was talking about. So my tools are all, I do use Macs to do this. Um, Really, the first tool is making sure you're recording in a quiet room. And if you can put up some sound treatment and things like that, you know, the room that I'm in right now that we're doing this in is just my office. I actually have a studio upstairs. So this room's a little bouncy, but it's not terrible. But putting some treatment on the wall in front of you so that it's not bouncing right back at you when you talk, and putting some above you can make a huge difference. You want to eliminate those what they call, you know, square waves or standing waves, where you've got two flat surfaces across from each other where the waves are just going to do this. You want to break it up a little bit, and foam padding can do it. Or if you've got, you know, weird shaped walls, that's even better. So that's one, is starting there. And then the second is the microphone you choose to use. I'm a big fan of dynamic mics, because in general, they tend to pick up less room noise than condensers. I know there's microphone professionals out there that are yelling at me. They're saying you can get a condenser to sound good. Of course you can. It's way easier to get a dynamic to sound good. So that, you know, and the Audio Technica, I think it's the 2005 USB, is a good sub $100 microphone that really sounds good. That's the one I use when I travel. You know, it sounds great. Doesn't pick up a whole lot of the hotels that I'm in and things like that, which is good. And then from there, um, I use Logic on the Mac to do my mixing, but I actually record. My setup's weird. I record, because I record live. You can't really record a mix live in Logic. You can record individual tracks, which I do as backups. But then I pump it out from Logic into a tool called Audio Hijack that records my final audio for me. But inside Logic is where I'm using their built-in noise gates, to kind of shut off my microphone when I'm not talking, or shut off my guest or co-host microphone when they're not talking, and that helps eliminate some of that noise. And then also using a healthy dose of what's called compression, which is not digital compression that shrinks a file down, but compression that shrinks the dynamic range of the audio so that the loudest part isn't too much louder than the softest part. And it does that by bringing the loudest part down almost automatically. And you can set the ratio to how much to squash it. I squash it a lot. Again, so that when people are talking, if somebody drifts off the mic or something, you know, like, you still get a good level. Zoom and even to some degree Skype and other things like that have a lot of compression built into them for exactly that reason. But I add my own, and we can, you know, that way we can control it and mix things together. And then one of my favorite little tips, especially with everybody doing things remotely now, but we've always done the podcast remotely, is I want it to sound like we're in the same room, not a noisy room, but the same room, even though we're, you know, thousands of miles apart or whatever. So I always take the full mix of everything, both speakers or three speakers if there's more than, you know, two people, and I run it through a touch of reverb, just a little bit, not so much that you hear it. In fact, I turn it up until I hear it and then I turn it back down. But it's just enough to kind of pull everybody into that same, virtual room so that it sounds like we're all sort of being treated the same way by the same bouncy walls. Hopefully not too bouncy, but so that's my extra trick.
Yeah, there are a lot of great tips in there. Yeah,
I
I
know.
think
I'm a geek. What can I say?
compressing your audio is really important just because no one likes getting, a super loud um, surprise in their ears. So that's definitely important.
Exactly.
I think this is one of the last questions. How do you promote your podcasts and get them in front of new listeners?
Not well enough. We can always do more. We're actually working on ways of sort of systematically doing more, building that into our workflow. But with Mac Geek Gab, we have the Mac Observer, which has millions of readers a month. So that's sort of an easy place to promote that show. But that show and the others we also promote on the various platforms that were the social platforms that we're on. So Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, depending on whether it's a video show or not. For sure, I highly recommend, and this is advice that I'm starting to take myself, but I'm not doing well enough with it. Highly recommend you ask your listeners to sign up on your email list, because you can send them an email every time a new episode is out. And if you're building decent show notes where you're actually including like links to the things that you talked about and, somewhat valuable stuff there, you can just have your show notes sent to the listeners to tell them, hey, there's a new episode up and here's all the things we talked about. And most people will appreciate that. And now they know that the show is up and all of that stuff. So leverage that email list. I know we all think email is like an ancient technology, but if you look at how much email you get every day, you can see it still works.
That's
I don't
definitely
know
true.
anybody that's like actively doing something that's not checking their email many times a day, let alone at least once a day. It is still a thing we are all a slave to, so we can leverage that. Yeah.
This question is kind of just for fun, but what podcasts do you subscribe to or follow yourself?
Yeah, so there's a few. I like Pendulette's podcast. He does a good job over there. I'm a fan of the band Fish, and I like Tom Marshall's Under the Scales podcast. So that's another one that I listen to. Um, there's a few others. I really like the Daily. I like what they're doing with that over at the New York Times. I like how it's kind of bite sized and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's three. Yeah.
Yeah, the daily is definitely one of my favorites as well.
Yeah.
And then the last question is, Dave, how can people find you if they want to interact with you or listen to some of your shows? Where can they find all that?
Sure. Yeah. The easiest way to find me is on Twitter at Dave Hamilton. That'll kind of get you to everything that I do. But the shows are macgeekgab.com, giggabpodcast.com, and businessshow.co.
Very nice. Dave, thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your knowledge and all the tips that you've shared. Definitely we'll have to do more of these together.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. This is a blast. Thank you.